So welcome, very welcome all of you to our event tonight, from Irish fever to Chinese flu, the racialization of epidemics, organized by the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center at London Metropolitan University, for those of you who are coming from outside. Our center is absolutely fantastic. We launched it in September. We've got good number of events organized for this semester. Just next week we've got the last one before Christmas, and then we've got a good program of events organized for next semester, next 2021. So I invite you, all of you, to go to our website and have a look and register in our events. Tonight we're here because we want to hear about more about this fantastic topic, which we titled From Irish Fever to Chinese Flu, the Racialization of Epidemics. We've got tonight two academics, Professor Doc McRail and Professor Louise Ryan, and three poets, Ian Dahik, and Anna Chen and Kit Fan. They will reflect on the historical and sociological contexts of how epidemics and pandemics become racialized through attributions to nations or groups of people. These five people that we are very lucky to have them with us tonight, they will reflect on the historical example of anti-Irish racism and the both historical and contemporary phenomenon of anti-Chinese behavior. This topic cannot beat timer at the time we live in, going through with this COVID-19 pandemic. So I find it extraordinary. There are different ways of looking into that, and that is exactly what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to introduce my speakers, my two first speakers, the two professors. But before that, let me just remind you a couple of things. We'll do, Don and Louise will do the presentation, and then we'll listen to the three poets. And then there will be time for questions and a bit of discussion on the things that will be addressed tonight in the presentation. So you've got two options: write your questions on the top of on the side of the screen, or raise your hand and then speak out your question for us. But this will be later. So let me just introduce Don and Louise first, and let's gonna listen to them. Doc McRail, Professor Doc McRail, is an authority on the Irish diaspora and British diaspora, having written or edited a dozen books, including The Irish Diaspora in Britain for Palgrave Macmillan. He has won funding for ARRC, ESRC, and Leverhulme, and has held chairs in New Zealand, Northern Ireland, and England. Don is a Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research here at London Metropolitan University. Professor Louise Ryan is Senior Professor of Sociology and Director of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center at London Metropolitan University. She has been researching migration for 20 years and published numerous books and highly cited articles on the topics in leading international journals. In 2015, she was awarded a fellowship of the Academy of Social Sciences for her contribution to migration research. So I pass them into you, Don and Louise, for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maria. Could we have these slides now, please? Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, I'm going to turn my video off to preserve bandwidth. I hope it won't be too much reverberation and whatnot. It's been a bit wobbly at first today. Well, anyway, here we are then. I think we need to leave that slide on for long. This event tonight is a consideration of racism and the way in which disease shapes racism, looking at the examples of the Irish from the mid-19th century and looking at through the contemporary lens at the Chinese in the present time. So Louise will range broadly, it's sociologically, though perhaps not restricted just to sociology. She'll make some historical references as well. I will locate myself in the 19th century where I feel most at home. And then we'll listen to the poets who are reflecting in their form about the way that the events of coronavirus and the way in which perhaps these issues of race, racism, and blame have affected their work. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Now, this is something that we hope will be the beginning rather than the end of a relationship. We're putting in for some funding to develop this theme of comparing an historical example and a contemporary one, because there are so many echoes. And that's where this really came from, the sort of comparativity of the way the Irish were perceived in relation to this thing, Irish fever, which was in fact typhus, and the usage in the contemporary world of the notion of Chinese fever, Chinese flu, and other derogatory terms to describe SARS-2 COVID. Let's begin with an apposite quotation from the press in Britain in 1914. No country will acknowledge that its shores are the birthplace of the flu. As with Irish fever, Chinese fever carried connotations of national responsibility, but this was not unique to either Ireland or to China. In Russia, influenza was known as the Siberian fever, and for Siberians it was the Chinese fever. For the French, la grippe, or Spanish catarrh. For the Germans, Schafkrankheit, sheep disease. And the Italians, blaming it on the Germans, call it malattia tedesca, the German disease. And the English, they just got mixed up and called it influenza because they misunderstood what the Italian term una influenza di freddo, the influence of the cold, actually meant. So there you go, running around the globe, blaming your next door neighbours for something which probably didn't start there. Now, what strikes me as really interesting about the Irish dimension of this is that the typhus fever had a bigger effect on the population of Ireland with its total demography of something like, probably in 1847, probably about 7 million. It was 8.2 million in 1841 and down to 6.5 million by 1851. So somewhere in the middle, 1847 was a year of most significant deaths and mass emigration, the worst year of the famine, and along came typhus to really make it worse. And this figure you can see in the second bar there for 1847 shows nearly 60,000 deaths in Ireland. Compare that, a population of around about 7 million, with the about 60,000 we just hit today, didn't we, in England and Wales, or was it, actually it's the whole of the UK, I apologise, with its population about 67 million. So this was a big thing. Not only was it a big thing in terms of Ireland, it was quite significant with 30,000 deaths in England, which was less than half the size that it is now. So it was big, and it was bigger than COVID here. But it was also not just an epidemic here, it was a pandemic. It had some Egyptian roots, some people say. Maybe it came from Asia, the usual blame game. It certainly spread to the British colonies. It was terrible in Montreal and parts of Canada, and it certainly spread to the US. So it was a pandemic as well as being originally an epidemic here. And it was called Irish fever because it was associated with the Irish and mass emigration from the famine, with a particularly poor, immiserated, hungry population who were particularly susceptible to disease. If we look at just doing a selection on search terms, looking for Irish fever in the British Library newspaper archive, you can see in the 19th century, you have mentions of Irish fever a lot. If you eliminate the references to Irish Fever Hospital, which of course has no meaning for us here, you do have this thing called Irish fever being mentioned. You do also with the Chinese fever as well. I haven't yet worked out what those actually are when they're not either typhus or COVID, but they're certainly referred to in other times. So you can see this occurs throughout the century, but there's a big jump in the 1840s. And within the 1840s, on the next graph, the one in grey, you can see that 1847 is the big year, but it's by no means insignificant in terms of mentions in 1846. Now, the thing about this disease is that it came at a time of famine. It came at a time of mass emigration. The population of Ireland falls significantly, and it continues to fall throughout the 19th century. So the population of Ireland doubles between 1780 and 1841, then it halves again by 1891. So people in Britain and further afield feared the importation of this unseen lethal baggage among those thousands who were leaving Ireland. as I said it before, it coincided with the Black 47. And crucially, this disease was louse-borne. So bodily hygiene was the key preventative measure. They opened fever hospitals, cordon sanitaire. They used forms of social isolation, etc. The same as, to some extent, the same as we're doing now. They constructed their own versions of Nightingale hospitals, but the difference is they actually used them. Anyway, and so this disease had a particular prevalent effect upon these Irish folk, because as transient migrants, as trampers, as people walking, to ferries and then from ferries into England, into Scotland and Wales, and then boarding boats and going to the United States, Canada and elsewhere, they really didn't have the opportunity to douse themselves, to actually have baths and washing and so on, to wash their clothes. And it was one of the first things that poor houses did to the Irish, was to wash them. It's not quite the carbolic spray they got at Ellis Island, but they certainly had their clothes cleaned or thrown away, and they themselves were bathed. So this was the key way of dealing with this thing. But this disease was centrally located in a poor population associated with the poorest population within the United Kingdom, and it raised in that sense, in terms of socioeconomic indicators, it raised some of the same issues we see with COVID and its effect upon the poorest, upon BAME populations and others. Don't want to overstress that, but certainly it has a particular effect on the Irish because of their circumstances and because of the socioeconomic and demographic and actually environmental factors that were surrounding them at that time. Just to show you this kind of transatlantic dimension, here are two engravings of Montreal and Liverpool, of the kinds of conditions which saw the spread of these diseases. This is a government medical inspector in Montreal. They even had a quarantine island, Gros Isle in Montreal, to try and keep the Irish in one place. Lots of deaths there. And in Liverpool, as you can see, living in some, really packed together, clearly sick and suffering from this disease. Now, what this project is about and what we're talking about tonight, and what our project in the larger sense over years hopefully will be about, is this issue of racism, the way in which disease and the association of disease with particular ethnic groups becomes caricatured and characterized in ways that really look like straightforward racism. Just to get one thing out of the way straight away, the kinds of things that were said about the Irish certainly strike me as racism. If they were said about anybody who wasn't also white by white people, they would certainly be accepted as racist. And in Victorian terms, they were hierarchized below Victorian Britons and so on. They were seen as being lower down the scale of human development. Darwinism later on would do terrible things for the Irish and others in terms of the ranking of Homo sapiens. But certainly in the 1840s, a particular time of intense socioeconomic, but also political turmoil. You have the year of revolutions in 1848. You have an Irish rising, a damn squib it was, but also an Irish rising in 1848. You have mass emigration. These people are Catholic. They're arriving in this fundamentalist Protestant environment, which becomes more so in response to their arriving Catholicism in the United States. The debate closing the gates altogether to the Irish and to wider European Catholics. The levels of antipathy towards Catholic Irish people in the 1840s and 1850s in Britain, and even more so in the United States, are very striking. Canada, also very Protestant, more low church Protestant than in Britain, but still also the Irish are vectored there through their Catholicism and through Protestant anti-Catholicism, no popery and the like. The racism against the Chinese is inexplicable in relation to numbers. You have racism in Britain when you have no more than a few hundred Chinese in the country, say in the 1890s through to the First World War. You have some extraordinary outbursts about the yellow peril, opium dens, prostitution, Chinese laundries. And yet even in Liverpool and London, there are only a few hundred Chinese. So it's really extraordinary levels of racism and racist thinking. Now, what is quite interesting as we begin to develop this project, and as I start to dig around in some of the historical material, is that the massive and overwhelming amount of visual material that you find in the likes of Punch magazine, Harper's Weekly, these these comic newspapers come periodicals in which there are lots of beautiful but grotesque cartoons. What you find is that stereotypes against the Irish are far more numerous in the States than they are in Britain, and those against the Chinese are fundamentally just hugely more evident in America than they are in Britain. What you do get, though, in the British world is reference to the Chinese in negative visual culture in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, where actually attitudes towards the Chinese and crucially modes of restriction and of exclusion are actually quite similar. So Britain generates very little interest really in the Chinese in its own population. It's because there is no gold rush in Britain. There are not many Chinese in Britain in the 1840s through the 1860s like there are in these other countries. But there's not even much interest in the Chinese as an object of kind of Orientalist fascination. Not really in that period. That comes later. And so you do in the English-speaking world more broadly, and we'll say the Anglo world to include America as well as the former British colonies, otherwise the British world. You do have the drawing of a colour line. And despite the racism against the Irish, they are on the white side of that colour line, though many in Irish America would try to argue otherwise and make some extraordinary claims about the similarity between their experience and that of slaves. This is going too far. But the Irish are on the white side of the colour line, and the Chinese, along with blacks, indentured labourers, Indians, others from Asia, other parts of South Asia, they're all on the other side of the colour line. And you see this reflected in these kind of what are cultural norms, really. So you do have cartoons against the Irish dating from around this sort of time in the 1840s. The English labourer's burden there. Look at this English yeoman, stout chap that he is. He looks a bit ragged. He's probably hungry himself. And he's carrying the old man of the sea, who's an Irishman, on his back, with a sum of money, which is the grant aid given to the Irish by the munificent British. Then you have Daniel O'Connell as the real potato blight, because he's still collecting repeal rents whilst people are hungry and dying. So both of these characterizations of Ireland are pretty gruesome, and they date to the 1840s. Here we have a couple of just random images that I pulled down because I was just quite interested in them. The way in which Punch reflects here anti-Chinese attitudes. The second one is interesting because the B represents Japan attacking China, but it's interesting how the Chinese chap is characterized. And here we have on the other side, on the left-hand side, we have Australia and Skippy the bush kangaroo trying to keep a Chinese chap out of Australia. This kind of image is really common in Australia. They have lots of this. Now, the thing is, to use Lucianne Salyer's term, laws harsh as tigers, the Chinese became a presence in big numbers in these colonies and in America from 1849 with the 49 Klondike gold strike and San Francisco, that's San Francisco, it's the California gold strike first, Klondike then the gold strike in Victoria, in Australia, and then in New Zealand in the 1860s. And it's interesting if you get lots of Irish swirling around the Pacific world, chasing their fortunes in gold, and you get lots of Chinese as well. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all introduced poll taxes to keep the Chinese out. And the UK didn't, as I say, didn't indulge in this kind of thing to the same extent. But again, there wasn't the same population pressure. I'm sure they would have if there had been lots of Chinese there in the 1850s. But let's not play counterfactual history. We don't really do that. But like its Anglo world partners, just as the Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders, then Americans in the 1880s all introduced laws to restrict or exclude the Chinese and indeed some other Asian labour as well. In 1905, 1919, the British also introduced laws which were really meant to restrict the numbers of Chinese sailors, Indian sailors, and it was very much driven by trade unions who were looking to support and protect white labour. You get the same thing with, in inverted commas, coolie labour in South Africa as well. So this colour line was a global colour line, and importantly so, and a very important feature of all of this. I think this is a good time to segue to Louise.
Thank you, Dawn. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up to date now and to look at what's been happening in the 20th and 21st century, particularly coming up towards the pandemic. So, as of course you're all aware, migration is certainly not a new phenomenon in Britain, but we have seen in the latter half of the 20th century a marked diversification of migrants, and clearly from the post-war period through to the beginning of the 21st century, these diverse migration flows have resulted in roughly about 8 million people in England and Wales, or 14% of the population, belonging to ethnic minority groups. And of course, as we know, these populations are dispersed throughout the country, but certain cities are particularly diverse and have been called super diverse, such as London and Liverpool. And so the 21st century has been described with circuits of migration, and connected medical practices are taking new forms, where on the one hand, migrants are still associated with disease and pollution, but on the other hand, migrants are also increasingly staffing the infrastructure of Western public health services. And this is a crucial point that I'll come back to again later, that there's a sort of a dual discourse going on. On the one hand, migrants are vilified as a burden, scroungers coming over here, using public services, putting a strain on public services, including the health service, while on the other hand, simultaneously to that, migrants make up a very significant part of the labour force running these public services, including the NHS. And that was something that was very visible during the pandemic. So clearly we live in a totally global and interconnected world. We're connected by trade, travel, technology, and the speed with which the pandemic crossed the world. If we think back to January, when we first started to hear about it, within weeks, this was a pandemic that was affecting almost every country on the planet. But what was also interesting is in harmony with the speed with which the disease was traveling around the world, we quickly saw national borders begin to close. So the nation state reasserting its significance as a way of blocking movement. And what this really illustrated is something that, we migration scholars have long been aware of, is that despite this kind of celebration of a very globalized world, a world of movement and connectivity, nation states still matter, and nation states have the ability to close their borders to prevent the movement of people. However, that doesn't always stop the movement of disease. So what we've observed here is a dual process of the deterritorialization of the disease. In other words, disease spreads everywhere. And the reterritorialization of bodies, the attempt to stop people from moving. And that's happened throughout the pandemic at all sorts of levels, not allowing people to go to Wales, for example, from England, but not allowing people to travel internationally either. So a real curtailment of movement. And of course, we've also seen how this has become ethnicized in different ways. And if you cast your minds back to January, February time, we can see how Chinese students, who up until this point were really the cash cows of universities, Chinese students were amongst the most sought after groups into British universities because they paid such extraordinarily high overseas student fees. But then they quickly became this kind of threat because they were coming back from China after the Christmas holidays, after the Chinese New Year, and there was this fear that they would be carrying this deadly disease. But we should also remember that it wasn't just foreign international travellers who were the super spreaders, but in fact some of the early super spreaders were actually British people, including those coming back from skiing holidays during the February half term. And I think if we try to remember some of the strongest visual images about the early days of the pandemic, particularly in this country, we will quickly remember those images of older, often very affluent, retired people who were caught on luxury cruise ships, where they then got stuck and they were kind of in quarantine on these cruise ships through February and March. So the very active travel. So it's not just migrants coming into the country, but British people going abroad, whether skiing or on cruises. there's also that risk that just mixing with foreigners, you can come back and become a super spreader. So it's really the movement of people which starts to become the big threat. Now, of course, since the Brexit referendum in 2016, the mechanisms to close the British borders have really intensified, and nowhere can we see clearer examples of that, with all the discussions that have gone on yesterday and today about the vaccine being imported from Belgium, and will Brexit make it harder for the vaccine to actually be imported into this country? But long before Brexit, the hostile environment against migrants was really firmly established as part of official British policy. And of course, the hostile environment was very much the brainchild of Theresa May when she was Home Secretary before she became Prime Minister. And we can see the impact of this kind of official policy to make the environment as hostile as possible for migrants, the spillover effect with the Windrush scandal, where people from the Caribbean who'd lived in Britain for most of their lives were suddenly having their status called into question and were facing deportation. So this has been an ongoing strategy in this country, and the pandemic has certainly exacerbated that. It didn't create that environment, but it's obviously made it much worse. And what we've seen here has been described by sociologists as a process of re-bordering. And Winmus et al. In an article in 2018 have talked about re-bordering processes as having moved from the margins of people's lives. In other words, when you encounter a border at an airport or a port, to become everyday life, with this kind of scrutiny of migrants and of ethnic minorities and their rights to be here, and their sense of belonging in the nation is now becoming part of that whole rebordering process against migration, and not just migrants but also ethnic minorities. And of course, this is very much associated then with scapegoating, because if you're already blaming migrants for anything that happens to go wrong in society, from taking jobs to being a burden on the health service, then from there it's a very small step to blaming them for other social ills as well. So according to a survey which was conducted in 2020 to just under 2,000 Chinese residents across many countries, as many as a quarter of them said that they had experienced some form of discrimination since the start of the pandemic. And it's been suggested that in Britain there's been a shocking level of anti-Chinese racism on display since the beginning of the pandemic. And Pang et al. In a paper from 2020 have said that discourse, attitudes and behaviour that invoke suspicion and rejection towards tourists, migrants, residents or national citizens of very distant Asian origin. And this is something, of course, we have also seen occur throughout Britain, is it's not just Chinese people per se who become the target for abuse, but it's anybody who even looks vaguely Chinese, regardless of where they come from, even if they're third generation British born and bred and may never have set foot in China. So it sort of casts everybody in the same light as to blame for the virus. So despite recent regards for Chinese people who have often been held up as model migrants in recent years, what we've seen with the pandemic, and this relates back to what Don was saying, is that how those echoes of history can be very quickly re-invoked. So although in recent years Chinese migrants have been seen as valuable foreign students and model migrants, they suddenly were jumping back 100 years to those 19th century stereotypes. And as well as the Chinese virus, the Chinese flu, the term yellow alert has been used in the French media, which very much strikes a chord with that notion of yellow peril from the 19th century. And the sociologist Walter Benjamin has conceptualized history as moments of crisis where we can seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. So at a point in danger, when you're looking for a scapegoat, those echoes from the past can quickly be re-invoked and those stereotypes can be brought right back up to date. Now, if we want an example of this, we have to look no further than the SARS breakout of the early 2000s. And some of you in the audience may be old enough to remember the SARS pandemic in the early 2000s, about 15, 16 years ago. And a piece of research which was done in Canada by Leung et al. In 2004, they really analysed the impact of SARS in Canada on the Chinese community. And they said that it echoes very clearly the historical discourses that attempted to contain, regulate and prevent the inclusion of Chinese Canadians within Canadian society. SARS, for example, was described by one Canadian newspaper as peril from the East. So again, this notion of peril, yellow peril, being played out in the 21st century. From the outset of the disease in Canada, it was strongly associated with foreign bodies, and the word super spreaders was used back then to describe SARS. And there was this tracking of how SARS had come to Canada from Hong Kong, how people had travelled to Canada, and they had brought SARS with them from Hong Kong. And this then fed through to really virulent anti-immigration discourses in Canada, which talked about Chinese people as super infectors, and even argued that immigration can kill you. So the very process of immigration actually posed such a threat to the nation that it could kill people. And this was not just rhetoric, because here, of course, we're talking about cartoons, we're talking about negative stereotypes, but these have real impact. And the research in Canada showed that during the SARS pandemic, there was a real decrease in the number of visitors to Chinatowns throughout Canada and decreased numbers of people going to Chinese restaurants. So there's a real economic impact for Chinese people as well. Now, going back to what Don was saying about the ways in which migrants have historically been blamed for the spread of disease, this works in a number of different ways, and a piece of research by Kraut, which was looking at America in the 19th century, talked about how nativist discourses associated America, the land of liberty and freedom, with health and vitality, so that the liberty of the American dream became manifest in physical health and vitality. And therefore, migrants, as associated with dirt and disease, were a threat to the health and vitality of American society. Now, this was sort of reimagined through Protestant discourses, and Don mentioned the role of Protestant religious leaders. In the 19th century, cholera in America was seen not just as a sign of physical weakness, but also as a sign of moral weakness. In other words, people who were sick only had themselves to blame. Not only were they physically weak, but it meant that they had some kind of moral weakness as well, that perhaps it was the wages of sin which had made them ill. And although we're talking about America, it's not that dissimilar from some of the discourses we also see in Britain in the 19th century, where Sir Benjamin Hall, for example, told the House of Commons that the Irish were spreading disease, especially smallpox and typhus, among an otherwise healthy British population. And so here we see the same kind of narrative being played out, that the nation is healthy. The nation is a place of good health and vitality. And if there's any kind of disease or sickness or weakness within the nation, then clearly it must be foreigners who've caused it, because this is something that's coming from outside to weaken the nation. So this is, I think, a really important thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the current pandemic and understanding how that gets conceptualized. So the racialized categories of inferior groups have been associated with particular diseases within a racialized hierarchy. And so the propensity to illness is assumed that some groups are more likely to get sick than others because almost of a sort of racial degeneracy, that they are just weaker, and that's why they get disease in the first place. And this is not just applied to migrants, to newcomers, but also, of course, to settled ethnic minority communities. So migrants and ethnic minorities more broadly are associated with particular kinds of practices particular kinds of cultural preferences, and risky behaviour that make them more prone to disease. This is the kind of narrative. We saw it in the 19th century, and interestingly, we're seeing it again now with the pandemic. So Rose and Novas in 2005 wrote about biological citizenship. In other words, it is the responsibility of every citizen to be healthy, to engage in healthy behaviour. And if somebody is not engaging in healthy behaviour, then it's kind of their own fault if they get sick. So discourses can therefore invoke cultural stereotypes that blame certain groups for getting sick. Studies persistently demonstrate, for example, in the US and in Europe, higher levels of tuberculosis amongst certain migrant populations. And this then very easily gets kind of medicalized and explained that maybe it's their cultural practices, it's their lifestyles, it's the way they live that make them prone to tuberculosis, rather than looking at wider structural issues such as poverty and poor housing. So to bring this to a conclusion, tracking through from the 19th century through the 20th century and into the 21st century, we see some remarkable similarities, those echoes of history that get repeated time and time again, especially, as Walter Benjamin says, at times of crisis, at times of pandemic, those old familiar scapegoats come out time and time again. And of course, particularly now in Britain, I think we need to be very careful because there is clearly a need to acknowledge the high numbers of deaths among some ethnic minorities in Britain from COVID-19. The real danger, the real risk here is that this starts to reinforce those old ethnic stereotypes and racialized hierarchies. In other words, this idea that some people are just more prone to getting sick, almost again because of some kind of cultural preferences, cultural practices. It's their own fault that they're getting sick and they're spreading the disease to an otherwise healthy population. And so we have to be very wary of these very medicalized discourses. We have a lot of virologists who get repeatedly interviewed in the media. And what's often missing from this kind of discussion of disease and transmission is a sociological analysis of the social issues that underpin transmission and a historical insight into the ways in which these stereotypes get perpetuated over time. So understanding how and why migrants and ethnic minorities have been blamed as super spreaders of disease is necessary so that we can avoid the mistakes of the past and avoid reinforcing those racist and discriminatory practices in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Dawn. These were fantastic presentations. I'm going to introduce now the three poets before they read a poetry. Ian Dahek has won several prizes for his poetry, including the National Poetry Competition twice, and a Chamley Award, and is a former International Writer Fellow at Trinity College Dublin. He's also a social activist with a background in homelessness that sharpens his awareness of health issues among the vulnerable. He's currently working with Leeds Irish Health and Homes on a publication chronicling various creative responses to COVID-19 in that city. Anne Chen is a writer, poet, and broadcaster. She has written and presented programmes for BBC Radio 4 and presented an arts series, Madame Meow's Culture Lounge, at Resonance FM. Her stage shows include Mae Wong Must Die, The Steampunk Opium Wars, and I, Imelda. Her first poetry book, written for Mike New, is published by Arch Press, and her new collection, Chiche's Glorious Swanson, is due out later this year. Kit Fan's second collection, As Slow as Possible, was a Poetry Book Society recommendation and the Irish Times Poetry Book of the Year. Diamond Hill, his debut novel about Hong Kong, will be published by Dialogue Books, Little, Brown and World editions in May 2021. He was a winner of a Northern Writers Award and the Poetry Magazine's Editor's Prize of Reviewing. So, Ian, did you want to start?
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can all
Thank you.
hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Right. I'm honoured to be part of this event, which I think is very important, and particularly to be reading with Anna, Chen and Kit Fan. On the spectrum of the issues as we are dealing with, I'm in the past for all sorts of good reasons, I suppose. But when I discussed it with Anna and Kit, we both observed how echoes of the past, as Don described them, ancient stereotypes are activated, and just how deep this goes. So I'm taking a long run up with my first poem, Water Clock, looking at the Black Death, an aspect of that. A German academic, Konrad of Mecklenburg, I quote from one of his books, but also from the Flagellant's hymn, Water Clock. Through the glass of his water clock, Konrad of Mecklenburg reflected on the weeping crocodiles of torchlight that crawled across his window pane, then fell, the adulterers face down, perjurers on one side, fingers raised. Had it not been for our contrition, all Christendom had met perdition. What he took for rosaries were whips. This plague is of promiscuous effect. It cannot therefore be God's work, he scratched in his book of nature. Some blame the Jews, which is illogic. Their Viennese dead put out the stars. The clock dipped. He put fists of aloe, calamite and storax on the open fire. Konrad thought, but did not write. Here we spit our Jews and lepers. Cyprus blames and burns its Arabs, Narbonne its English merchants. All waste the best plague preserves, and her true love will not restore it. His front door banged, and he started, spilling the time from his water clock. The Flagellants were like anti-vaxxers of their day. You know, you shouldn't interfere with the course of the plague. They thought they were dealing with something which was God's judgment, and their flogging of themselves actually spread the disease further. In England, in Piers Plowman, Langland actually said the worst thing about the Black Death was that it didn't go on long enough. There weren't enough people killed by it. And from that time, I used a form. I suppose oral forms interested me when I was writing this, catchy forms, literally contagious forms. From people who didn't always have access to writing. But this takes on the form of a Middle English poem called The Names of the Hare, but this is called The Names of the Plague, and is much more contemporary. The blame gamer, the ill shamer, the brave killer, the grave filler, the buck passer, the eyeglasser, the sight saver, the night raver, the face shaker, the rule breaker, the duff ruler, the bluff fooler, the world beater, the word eater, the first aider, the worst paider, the spit sailor, the inhaler, the high fever, the deep griever, the dry cougher, the hat duffer, the cold creeper, the old reaper, the youth wrecker, the truth checker, the head cracker, the lost tracker, the host racer, the slow tracer, the job loser, the lost boozer, the cramped homer, the spread coma, the room slayer, the doomslayer, the doomsayer, the sick tricker, the nitpicker, the mad chatter, the foil hatter, the mask hater, the nurse baiter, the flock fleecer, the palm greaser, the deal lander, the backhander, the wrong richer, the song hitcher, the rhyme rider, the time bider. Its chief name is Legion. This is actually called Irish fever, and it's complicated, it's clotted, it's thick in my mouth as I read it, and I suppose it's something to do with the complexity of heritage. My family are relatively recent immigrants, but the Irish presence in England, indeed my surname, goes back well into the 19th century. There's a bit in it where I talk about the Back to France city. If anybody wants to know more about that, Patrick Nutkin's book has that as a subtitle. Irish Fever, with an epigraph from Jory Graham. Poetry wants to be contagious, to be a contagion. Some here once got feverish even among the healthy Irish, feeling them a foreign body, hearts faithless, temper bloody, couldn't trust what they said. Their alien speech was as thick as thieves, thick in their heads as Leeds blood red clay bricks. The quatrains that I now write are a crossed kind, half bricks of air and clay made flesh, sick flesh where my contagions riot. Air bricks help homes breathe. They clean their tenants' lungs, noom-shaped, meaning breath. They are the blocks I can sing in the so-called back to France, inside, upside down city, a looking glass for its servants, good for the crack. My rickety back to back rose while most got condemned as germ traps, but the council was strapped for cash, and they'd be missed. This is my house now. Aloud, each line risks a health hazard. My contrary blood fills its cells, is its ink, its heart, my ill well. In terms of catchy forms, I have two songs here for the 19th century, second generation Irish Leeds poet and socialist agitator Tom Maguire, who is remembered in socialism. Recently, Richard Bergen MP instituted the annual Tom Maguire lecture again. I won't say that much about him. I think some of what I write makes it clear enough where he's coming from, I suppose. This is called Mayfly's Song. It has an epigraph from Ibn al-Wadi. The plague did its work like a silkworm. Worms make silk like Milton wrote, said Marx. The old proverb told us we're all Adam's children, but silk makes the difference. Being a poet, Maguire knew how the mill women mouthed and signed above the din at a sleepy child, a mule scavenger, dozy under the machines, in danger, and swore to speak for these muted. Clothes are cheap in the world today, runs a line from his poem Minotaur, where he rights wrongs they endure, song-like, of cholera rags, diphtheric bags, sent to Leeds, then to the devil, once rendered thread by these quick, too soon dead. Fate, Tom unravelled. My page is a mess of ink and milk, spilled for the slum Irish who die in silence like the mouthless mayfly. This song is made from mayfly silk. Maguire dies. Victorious warrior in the gas strike Engels called the Battle of Leeds. Born to famine Irish, now Maguire is a shy poet dying from lung disease. He makes his verse just as catchy, that mischievous micro ballad in a meter that's always infectious, and for our times too, just as valid. I shall swarm in myriad millions on the banks of the River Aire, and your old acquaintance Typhus will be present with me there. I shall raise Tom's good old song with the stench of his tenter lane. I'm catching his meter too to sing, so for me he didn't write in vain. He warned how the powers that be will ignore the sanitary crew and allow the wheels of mammoth to roll right over me and you. He knew it was the old story, though dying before he was 30. His kind no friend to the Tory. Irish Engels once thought just dirty. And this thing about dirt that was mentioned earlier, my last poem is called On the Rope, but I'm thinking here, I suppose, about Robert Graves, whose family were Irish, in his Goodbye to All That, where he mentions how they had a rank of the dirtiest people in the trenches, and of course the Irish were the dirtiest. This is called On the Rope. In the hostel I worked in New York, it was near Wormgate, where Surgeon Proctor, who I quote, was actually specifically thinking about Wormgate. But On the Rope meant if you were too poor to afford a bed, a rope was slung across the cellar and you leant on it like that, and that was your sleep. On the Rope. Black 47 in York's Irish slum, where Surgeon Proctor rouses fears against those who swarm together in the lodging houses. Swarm is the dog whistle word, its main victims given in terms of a disease returned from abroad, as if the dying Irish were germs. When working for York Council, I met a famine Irish descendant on my shifts in a homeless hostel, a long-term, troublesome resident. If on at night, whatever you did, you couldn't let him help with it, tiny authority rushed to his head, and he treats the others like shit. In a bad bout of his lung disease, he had frightening hallucinations. He was young once more in these, but earning ghostly imprecations. He thought filth those on the rope in his Irish father's lodging house, but how he chose to wake them up showed he in turn could be a louse. He crept down to the cellared poor, undid the knot so the snoring men crashed face first to the stone floor. Now he was seeing them rise again, alive with diseases of every kind, crawling with them up to his bed, crawling with them into his mind, and soon enough he too was dead. So I pass on this poem like a virus. Now he's in hell, or maybe heaven, as one legacy of famine survivors who fled to York in that black 47. I'm now going to pass on to Anna Chen, who will read from her poetry now.
Why, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yes.
Great, thank you. That took me by surprise. Sorry, I wasn't expecting that then. I'm going to start off with a poem that I think sums up where we are today, and I think is a metaphor. I actually wrote it about, over 10 years ago. It's about the most famous Chinese American woman, certainly in the 20th century, Mae Wong, who was a great silver screen legend. And she didn't have a terribly good time. She was third generation American, born in LA in 1905, and she had it bad. So this is called Mae Wong Must Die. Down in the alleys of old Chinatown, in the gaudy-bawdy back streets of sinister renown, dope peddlers peddle, the dragon gets chased. It's the same old story, the same yellow face. The man with the Fu Manchu opium embrace could kill you in an instant and never leave a trace. He knows all the tricks how to get you high, and that's why Mae Wong must die. Down in the sewers of Chinatown Way, Chinamen get chinkified every single day. Little yellow people all merging into one. You eat their rice for punishment, their noodles are no fun. Robotic ant-like army with phasers set to stun. Marching across the countryside, nowhere left to run. Here's a tall poppy soaring in the sky, and that's why Mae Wong must die. Silver screen dreams in black and white, but without the black bits, so that's all right. Along came a flapper, a cute little score. The women went ooh, and the boys went four. Black hair, almond eyes, a figure to adore. Yellow skin glistening, sticking in their craw. There's a comet in the heavens, the end is nigh, and that's why Mae Wong must die. Who's that upstart flouting all the rules? Not one thing or the other, fall between two stools. It's Anna getting cocky, Anna out of line. Anna, take your punishment, Anna, do your time. Scary Chinese nemesis looking mighty sly. Crush the dragon lady, the mastermind of crime. Anna kissed a white boy and made him cry. And that's why Mae Wong must die. Thank you. That was about someone from history, and I adored her actually from when I was a kid. This one is more specific. I'm bringing us up to date, and this is what actually happened to me during the lockdown. So this is part of my experience. It's called Wisdom. The thing I remember most with a chill is filing down my own teeth. I'd been ill, caught a cough before Christmas, missed New Year, my molars failed in February, fear of the fog in my brain, the driest hack, such timing, I should have been a comic. Sick, I snagged the crown under corona, my right wisdom tooth, a scalding caldera, caved in and cratered like a collapsed volcano, its filling failed and gapped, hollowed out like the doomed civilization, crumbling along with my teeth. My tongue sieves white and grey grains from meals, bits of me I mistook for gravel. It feels like ivory, and the silver my ancestors panned in rivers of dreams in strangest lands, like the dream where you push out your teeth with your tongue, popping them out from unstable gums. When I am ibuprofened up and wailing in bed, slooshes of salt giving no relief, a magnum lolly stick provides a brief great wall between tongue root and sawtooth edge. I am not feeling lucky today, punk. The world locks down, my hopes are sunk. Emergency 111 tells me again and again there is no dentist this side of the Thames to mend me, make me normal and healthy. Even if I could afford the cab across the county, that's how I came to be pressing an emery board to errant Fang. This treacherous fraud that is no friend, the sharpest serpent's tooth treacherous at the end, it must be gone. I am an impatient. Deep breaths, a short countdown. My shaking hand drags the glinting abrasive its entire length. Somewhere a civilization cries out for a dentist to fill the hole where a nerve used to be, to heal broken souls of fallen kingdoms. Like my mouth, they have no wisdom. Thank you. And this one is there's so much scapegoating going on, and obviously, you know, we're looking at the ethnicity of this, but we've forgotten older people because, of course, boomers have been on the receiving end of a lot of hate. So this one is entitled Boomers. Ian thought it should be called Boomer Removal, which I'm thinking about. So baby boomers passed like a pig through a python. Every generation gets its visionaries, seers and pioneers, mostly too few to gain traction. But when a fraction of the whole forms a critical mass, boomers curve time and space. They freshen the breeze to a storm, swell the seas to a tsunami roll, shape the world, punch a hole through the skinny blue to a heavenly banquet of infinite possibilities. But the bulge blown, a shrinking mass adheres to itself in solipsistic narcissisms of small differences, entropic of cancer, the inward spiral of I into other. Growing up, I wondered where that boomer sensibility lay. It was just taking its time to work its way through unto the exit in peristaltic waves like bacon through snake. Demographics give life or make us fools. The superstructure, its art and soul, sinks back into the economic base like a wedding cake melts its tears in rain. Thank you. A bit of Ray Batty creeping in there at the end. This is another one, a real one, what I experienced. It's called History Rhymes. How many times have I watched the moon slice open the night across the hedgerows and seen the church tower burst out on white fire, lighting up like 7 centuries of truth? Genuinely ancient, not a Victorian Gothic knockoff. What has it seen? It whispers its history to me and gets medieval on my ass. From 13th century, unlucky for some, nation states are born, others take their last breath. Crusaders carving their craziness through popes and princes and the Black Death. Its arched windows witnessed every sun since it squatted itself sturdily among monastery graves and monk-attended gardens, saw modern history crawl like a lungfish out of the sea. Under its long black eye, the world turned from dark to light and back again. Ricocheted in a flash of gunpowder, the grim paws of the doodlebug's purr, the wailing siren, the tolling bells. It stood firmly unswung through the 60s to Star Wars, while empires rose, devoured, and fell. Across the road, my neighbour's house, 1667, picked out in relief on the wall. So much history from the English Revolution, Cavaliers and Roundheads, Catholics and Kings, the Great Fire of London, the scientific age of enlightenment born in the wake of the plague. I can only imagine and thank my lucky stars, blinded out by the moon, that the end of history means the tower, my neighbour's house, and I, blessed and graced with the most tedious of times, have escaped our visit from the 4 horsemen, these many moons passing. For are we not modern men and women, not given to histrionics and the big event? How long have I got? Oh, great. So I can do more. So I think, I'll do a short one, because I think this is where we're all headed if we don't start to love each other, basically. And I'd like some adults to walk into the room and get us out of this, please. So it's called nuclear. Oh God, I sound like Trump. Nuclear. It's Nuclear Showcase. The Japanese were on their knees. The Yanks could have used tanks, but thanks to the banks, the arms race required a nuclear waste, weapons to try, flesh to fry, minds to explode, and an open road to the man-made sun that brings darkness. And this one I think is really pertinent now. Again, it's one that I wrote about 10 years ago. Call me Cassandra, but it really is pertinent to my life now. It's called The Dis Persists. Are there any Muslims in the house? I so feel for you, 'cause when the moving finger writes, and having writ it points at you, you're screwed. Nor all thy piety nor wit can talk sense into someone with a bloody great axe to grind and pinholes for eyes. They despise everything about you and will make up stuff they can't find. Nor will all thy tears move them to care about the consequences of their fears made manifest, although a punch in the gob works wonders, so I am told. Still the dis persists. When you prick someone like me, do I not bleed? Acid. When you tickle me, I make a rasping sound like a snake. If you poison us, do we not gobble it down like Flavor Aid, the way Popeye ate his spinach? It puts muscles on our muscles and is good for the complexion, which is why when we are 60, we look 16, we get fed so much of it. For are we not a cruel race? I'm told that often by people who are cruel, who make a virtue of their viciousness in the way only the truly callous can, who then turn round and say, "Ha, we can do that to you. True, we can, and there's nothing you can do." So here I am, furiously stroking my pussy like a comic book villain and twirling my moustache, which I call lyrical because I wax it. No point wasting love on me, I'd only be confused. Huh, what's this then? We devour our young, you know, with garlic and soya sauce and a lacing of melamine in the milk. Others prefer theirs with a dollop of poverty, each to their own ilk. Like the big yellow I am, I contain multitudes of other people's crap. Assumptions, projections, defections, rejections. What is your damage? Oh, it's me. I store everything, but no explosives unless you count this. No guns allowed, or perishables like the remnants of my self-belief, like the soul I once had and quite liked actually, but now lies raw and bloody on life support in A&E, having been given a kicking by every wanker without a wife to beat up when the booze runs out. Give her a clout. Pinball punchbag bitch who bites back, give her a slap. I contain your crap. Explosives are banned. They blow your mind and fats go rancid. I am your reflection in the deepest night, when your bowels pack up and collapse in fright. I am the yellow brick road to hell. I am that part of you that is not well. Yellow dog, yellow peril, yellow fear, yellow feral, yellow fever, a letterbox beaver. The stripes on a wasp, the colour of piss. I resist, but still the dis persists, and still the dis persists. Should I slip my wrists or just get pissed? I grind my teeth and shake my fist. I'm diced and dissed. I remain unkissed, and still the dis persists, and still the dis persists. So, stick me with a yellow star. I see it coming down the tracks. Must be junk left over from the opium wars. I should have stuck to crack. Thank you. I've got one more. What's the time? Oh, I think I've done 12 minutes. So can I do one more? This is about now, but written a while back. Call me Cassandra. Anyway, this one is called In This Time Between Times, and it's my last poem of my session. In this time between times, suspended like a mordant menopause and absence between events, should I stockpile in preparation for horror to come? Water, baked beans, soups, freeze-dried fruits, loot plucked from the supermarket shelf of knowledge. Let us eat cake in supplication, a last feast, an offering to the deity, that I might be spared the worst. Water purification for the descent of the cursed, into a hell circle to slake a thirst, a camp stove for warmth, a candle for light in the Neolithic dark. Do I feed squirrels because they are cute, or in case I need them to feed me one day? Some bastard already got the wood pigeons, grown fat on my grain, left me the ferals, thanks very much. In this time between times, you smell smoke but are too polite to yell fire in the crowded theatre and fear you will fry. In this time between times, news piles in like unopened bills, heaping on the hall mat, harried by dogs. You know all their demons will come flying out one day. In this time between times, the tide draws out further than the eye can see and the mind can comprehend. Strictly X-Factor dope fiend fans snicker and stare with dead eyes in the blink before the tide turns. Trapped in an amber instant, between ebb and flow, between stop and go, in the glow of the false moon in the corner of the room, with nothing but glass between us and the crashing wave. We are edged closer to the precipice. Lemmings swept before the great Disney broom, its forward momentum unstoppable as time. Whoops, there goes the wit and raconteur. Eek, there goes the artist who led a nation to freedom. We await our place in the queue, shuffling to the chasm, a void for the lucky, Satan's stocking suspended over the fireplace for those who are not. In this time between times, in a dream where fleeing is like running through wet cement, which is like treacle, which is like black molten dreams, which are like shadows detached and coming after you like mad marionettes cut loose from their strings, with you in their scope, like sharks' eyes, like glittering coals, like something with teeth reflecting nothing as the sphere of the moon rolls between us and the sun, and all you can do is stare in dread and awe at the thing you know is coming. Thank you. And now, what's coming next? I'd like to introduce Kit Fan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can
Yeah.
both hear you and see you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ian. It's great pleasure to be reading with you both. And I also want to thank Dawn, Maria, and also Louis for providing me, for giving such an important event, and also linking the event to poetry, to this, the pulse of this very troubling moment. I also want to thank the audience. It's great to see so many of you here. I know it's not easy to spend so much of our existence in front of the screen. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to read 4 poems. These are 4 poems that I wrote for this occasion. I didn't expect to write poetry actually during the lockdown, because I work in a medical school up north, so in York, and life has been pretty difficult, and also a lot of my clinical colleagues are having a very tough time. But I think the invitation actually helped me to get away with some of these very troubling times, and I managed to write 4 poems for it. So the first one is called "What You Look Like," and many of you would have seen I suppose one of the most frequently seen images when you turn on the news on telly might be the shape of the coronavirus, which is kind of round shape, and it has spikes and crowns sticking out. Often you see it in a kind of microscopic form, and sometimes you see it in a caricature. As we now know, those spikes or crowns are the strength of the virus, but also the weakness of it. And some of the candidate vaccines are really kind of attacking that crowns and the spike. So this poem is thinking about what you look like. What you look like. Like courtroom sketches of the accused, devoid of all expression. Your limpid membrane looks as lifeless as the dark side of the moon. Your spike glycoprotein, red as roses, nimble as hands. Though electron microscopically speaking, they aren't scarlet or vermilion. Nothing to do with blood or lust, crowns or aggression, but 2 interlocking subunits, like a labyrinth of knitted wool, with endings and openings that give your unmistakable binding grip, but also makes you vulnerable, not unlike the flaws our maker forgets when reproducing his own image. While in the background of the newsroom, sometimes you look like Yayoi Kusuma's infinite polka dots, and sometimes like Kandinsky unfinished circles in boxes, or Suha's pointillistic calm stolen from the grey smoke and chimneys on the horizon, which still looks like our own horizon now. And although nothing any longer is impossible with Athena's shield and spear, for months I've failed to commit your portrait to memory, as if what you look like is not what you really look like when people describe you generically as almond-eyed with creaseless lids, bespeckled, black-haired, funny-nosed, masked, and foreign. I was reading The Guardian last week, and there's a report about Dover, and I'm just going to read out that little report, a few sentences from the report. It says, scumbags barked Lynn Beckett on King Street in answer to the question of what accounted for Dover's rapid rise in infection. She was referring, she explained unapologetically, to East Europeans, whom she blamed for the spread. There's another resident, Kevin Harris, who said, in confidence, between you and me, it has been done deliberately by China. I'm going to read this poem called The Unexpected. We heard a lot of the word called unprecedented during this pandemic, and as Don and Luis kind of showed, actually sicknesses are not always unprecedented. There is some particular reference in this poem evoking Philip Pullman's The Dark Material, in which Lara, the main character, has a demon called Pantalaimon. So there's Pantalaimon in this poem, but it's not Lara's demon. It's actually a cat me and my partner had, and we call him Pantalaimon, and he was called Pan. The Unexpected. We argue on air and inside our skulls about the question of origin, as if by locating it, blame can be passed on, guilt assigned to shift opinion, and an easy truth is summoned so that we are immune from what we fear most, which I know is no different from Pan, not the god of the wilderness and rustic music, but short for Pantalaimon, Lara's level-headed demon, who struggled with the cat flap and kept staring at the walls, as each story must end with aging. It could be something else. He coughed, sneezed, hungry for oxygen or fed up with the lack of it. Like our own demise, his brought sadness and pragmatism. A week after burying him, the carpet surveyor arrives. It has been months since a stranger trespassed the invisible domestic border. And where I come from, one is on guard not because of mistrust, but unfamiliarity. You eye me like an alien, and I spot your extraterritoriality. How the river Tiber, on which Rome was founded, transmigrated into the Hungarian name you wear on the company shirt. As you crouch, kneel on all four, dive head down with a spirit level and measuring tape, examining the hallway, staircase, and landing. Transient places we transit through but never linger in, that determine the positive and negative. The yang and yin breathing through a house, a person, or a country trying to recreate past incompatible with the climate of our time. but you exist, dear stranger. Polite, unimposing, you ask to be seated near me as your Lenovo calculates the optimal coverage for all the pieces you have appraised. It's like Tetris. Your eyes reach beyond the window to a birch shivering, and mine fix on the L-shaped, S-shaped blocks being shuffled into a unified plane. When you start speaking like an open river about the life-changing illness you encountered 1 year ago today, how you survived it and walked again against the odds, and how the medication and confinement have turned you from a stick into a wheelbarrow. The calm, muffled words from your covered mouth are hiding a face of hardship that no longer needs reassurance. The computation ends with an 84% coverage, and you drag an I shape next to a square, scoring 86. We say take care to each other. You look me in the eye. I would have shaken your hand, my friend, and meant it. The door opens to a branch laden with commerce pears. You ask if you can pick one and wrap it in newspapers, as in the old days in a dark, cool place near the Danube, where you waited for flesh to come true in its own unrushed, unsynchronized duration. Some sweetening to paradise, some flowering into wild mauve green planets on a rack, infusing the air with a chance of microbes. It was a very awkward moment when the carpet surveyor came to the house, and we couldn't really offer him a cup of tea. And I think something as British as a cup of tea cannot be offered. And that really was a moment of crisis for him and for us as well. So it's great that he was able to take a pair. I'm going to read a poem called The Art of Invisibility. The November sun barely bent through the cumulus obstacles. The birch had lost her jade. The empty road ushered me back to those shut mouths on the bus 19 autumns ago. 3 teens peeling off their hoods, smiling, turning into monkeys, calling me Ching Ching. And I looked away. I always look away in these circumstances when others near me look away from me many times. As now, masked up in the open air, having picked up a dressed crab for dinner, looking for my bike as the dense crowds around me disperse and 2 boys point at my helmet, laughing, and I look away. I'm going to end with a poem called With or Without. I think many of us would have experienced, especially during spring, this particular springtime, when the intensity of, we were surrounded by the intensity of growth, but we don't have a lot of movement. And I think it kind of made me think about what I can live with and what I can live without. And actually, that's kind of either or situation was constantly in my mind. So this poem is called With or Without. Late March, what's in the air is in the numbers. is in the mind that enforces and rebels, that tries to breathe, not to breathe too much. Wallace says there are 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, even from a window in Wuhan. But here we only choose between health and liberty, as if health isn't liberty. We retreat, and other species reclaim the streets as we hear less of ourselves. What if touch is self-censorship? Hands and mouths are nationless. Derek, who died last week, says, when all is finished, Ivy will win and remember us. A yellow-beaked, obsidian-feathered couple returns to the downpipe, darting alternately in and out of the ivy. To procreate, hatch, and fly. Now, what are the chances? 1 in 3? The hours conjugate and blur into lost Cantonese words, unsayable between mother and son. The wind scratches, no way in. The sky isn't bothered by the sirens or a sudden cloud with or without lining. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kit, and thank you, Anna, and Ian, and Louis, and Don. Thank you all for looking into this topic from such a different angles. It's just absolutely fantastic. I just couldn't stop making notes, and I'll come back to some concepts with you individually. I just want to pass that into colleagues and see if anybody wants to make a question to the speakers, to the poets, to Don and Louis, etc. Just raise your hand or write your message in the chat box, which is on the side of the system, of the blackboard. While we're waiting for any questions, somebody who wants to, we've got a hand raised already. Is that,
That's you.
Is it me? Oh, is it me? Oh, I did that by mistake. Anyway, I just take my turn and I make a couple of questions. Am I wrong if I say that you all looked into the notion of a stigma? And how we human beings need to blame somebody for something. We always need to blame anybody. We're looking into, ethnic groups or nationalities, groups of peoples, communities, to find somebody to blame for what is happening. That happened in your presentation, Dawn. It happened certainly in Louis' presentation, and I could feel that in the three, listening to the three poets. Does any of you want to say something about it while we wait for some question?
There is a hand up, Maria, as well. So there is somebody. There's also a question.
Aha. Let me just Tele. Do you want to say your question?
Tele? It's not so much of a question. Perhaps the question will emerge. It's really to commend the two presentations from Louis and Don. By the way, I teach at London Met, and your contribution reminds me of the work I've done on the notion of purity ethics and fantasy about race. As it was interesting, the countries you alluded to, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, those countries are, I suppose, how the colonizer have phrased the boundary of understanding purity about race. By the way, the work of I like to cite Mary Douglas's work on dirt, and so it's the contribution very much is about cultural anthropology and how she suggests this purity system function in society, making the human body as a symbol for society in which the person lives with making the body a symbol of for society. So really what I'm suggesting, what I suppose what your contribution is consistent of is the is really, I suppose, the playing out of this fantasy about race, the racialization from the 17th to 18th century to current, how historically it's consistently been played out. Whereas the other are seen as unclean, so hence the purity. We are the clean, and the outsider is dirt. They bring disease. So you can understand even the immigration policy here, as well, I suppose, in those colonized countries, in America, Canada, and so on, how it just consistently been played out at the time of crisis. So it's a way of what is clearly subterranean during the time of plenty, as it were, but get evoked at the time of crisis, because that is really what the structure of society is about. In the time of crisis, you want to redraw the boundary now. And that's, for me, what your two presentations have consistently highlighted.
Okay. Who wants to answer that?
Louise, do you want to go first? Or
yeah, sure. Thank you, Tele. Yeah, Mary Douglas's work on dirt. Yes, thank you for reminding me of that and making that connection. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we see here, as you said, is the way in which things can sort of, you use the word subterranean, how things can kind of go into a latent phase, but suddenly they can come back out again into a manifest phase when there's a crisis. And I think we see that very much with the changing attitudes towards Chinese. I gave the example of Chinese students who are very, very highly valued, the kind of cash cow of so many universities, and going from sort of hero to villain almost overnight in this time of pandemic. And we can see how this is why I think we need the historical lens, because so much of what's happening now, and I think the poet said as well, that things are seen as unprecedented. This has never happened before. This is unprecedented. In fact, it's not. Any historian will tell you this is not unprecedented. This has happened before, and it will happen again. And it's because we fail to learn the lessons of history, which is why we doom ourselves to keep repeating the mistakes. And that's why I think this project that Don and I are working on is so important. I would say that, of course, because it's bringing together the sociological insights with that historical knowledge of what has happened in the past. And I think that's really going to help us to see how these racialized, racist stereotypes go in and out of fashion, but they can be re-invoked so quickly in moments of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously a very wide-ranging statement, telling, very interesting. It brought to mind, actually, and somebody I'm sure you'll know, W.E. Du Bois. We have this sort of concept of whiteness, which I think, in a sense, drawing those colour lines, excluding and including, reminds me all the time of the invention of whiteness. And actually what W.E. Du Bois called the psychological wage. That's where this idea comes from him, first African-American to graduate with a doctorate from Harvard in the 1890s. And he said that, the psychological wage, the requirement of black people in America and others of color, was to accept the psychological wage, to accept the idea of the white republic in order to be accepted. But the acceptance was always conditional on factors like socioeconomic change, and therefore was never really true, and could always be varied, and could always be withdrawn. So no one has a problem with the Chinese when you need labour in those gold fields. But as the gold starts to run out, that's when the poll tax is introduced, or when the gold becomes harder to mine. So this would not occur in the case of an Irishman there. The Cornish, or the Welsh, for example, famous miners, but it did with the Chinese. So there's a lot to unpick in what you say, and I find myself in full agreement with what you were saying, and I know Mary Douglas's work, of course, as Louise does. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Louise says as well. The constant dialogue between past and present, without wishing to be presentist or historicist, and to kind of have your solutions before you even start your research. But actually, the lessons of history are very significant in this. They're really deep and rich, and crucially repetitive.
Yeah, and can I just add, I suppose this is what has been playing out with the Windrush crisis as well, and moving to Black Lives Matter and the persistent lynching of the black man in America with the Floyd experience.
Yeah, Floyd Patterson, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Anna's got her hand raised. Anna, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on, I mean, you never see Chinese people in the culture. Can you think of a pop star or an actor? I can think of Gok Wan, Lucy Liu, but she's American. You don't hear of anyone in Britain. And I think it's interesting, given that Britain was the main force in the Opium Wars, where they mass-produced opium and they forced in Bengal, more stolen land, and they forced it on the Chinese at gunpoint. So I think there is a reason, I don't know if this is deliberate, but it certainly serves a purpose, which is if we're rendered invisible, if we're not in the culture, and we really are kept out, we moan about it all the time, what it means is that you're constantly a blank canvas on which anyone can project their fears and their demons. And I think there's also a geopolitical, purpose, or there's certainly a geopolitical effect with this, because it means you've got a constant reservoir, a permanent reservoir of scapegoats when things go wrong. There are certain minorities which you're not supposed to be racist to, although I think the whole Windrush situation now, where Black Britons are being treated like this, is just a nightmare. I think Muslims were the last group, obviously Jews, you've had Jews in the Holocaust, Muslims treated awfully post 9/11. So I just wanted to say I felt for years, certainly since the Project for the America in the 21st Century, W. Bush standing in the rubble of Iraq in 2005 and saying China is a competitor, and then you look at what happened to the partition, the smashing up of Yugoslavia at the start of this line. It just feels they're all being ticked off. And in 2005, when I heard W saying that, I thought, oh, I wonder who's at the end of this list. And I think it's quite clear. So yes, I think one of the reasons that Chinese, and in particular, but Asians, East Asians also, are kept out of the culture is so that this can erupt again, what you've been talking about.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Tele, for your question. I can see Gary has his hand raised. Gary, did you want to say? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. Congratulations to the speakers and the poets. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed lots of that, and there was some really things that resonated with me, because I'm an immigrant myself in the UK, and I'm an immigrant also. I lived in North America frequently as well, and particularly the poetry I felt was really great at the end. I love poetry and enjoy it even more with a drink in my hand. So I must confess, I did have a glass of wine while I was listening. It was really good. And I really enjoyed the final poem, which was just hit the nail for me. It was really good. But Don mentioned in the 1800s in New Zealand, where I'm from, the Chinese gold rush period. And I do remember hearing a story that 100 more years later that, you know, look at the way the Chinese did their gold mining. They left a mess here, but the Europeans all tidily cleaned up everything and made it. And I thought, well, that looks like a load of rubbish to me. It's just a bunch of stones that have fallen over. Maybe who knows who did it. But that was one of the sentiments I remember from my childhood. And then from Louise, I also lived in Canada at the time of SARS. And I lived in Vancouver, which was the big route from Asia, from Hong Kong into Vancouver, into Canada, and then through to Toronto. And really, I didn't feel at that time there was a sentiment of anti-Chinese. Everyone knew the virus was coming from Hong Kong. That's where it started. That's where it came from. And it spread across Canada quite badly. It got badly hit. But it really was in Toronto in the hospitals, and it was a feeling that they didn't do the proper kind of nursing and treating these patients that they should have been to stop spreading the virus. So that would be, I don't have a question for you. I think it was all wonderful. Just a couple of comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy.
Thank you. Does anybody want to comment on that, or we just go to Mary Taylor's Lewis question that she left in the chat box? This is broad questions relating to Lewis' talk on migrants threatening the health of the nation. Did you notice a difference in the treatment between economic migrants and refugees? For example, were certain types of migrants more likely to be stigmatized against? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Definitely, there is a sort of hierarchy about the stigmatization of migrants, and particularly, I mean, it's all of these things that are happening simultaneously. What was going on in the Channel just a few weeks ago, people dying in the Channel, and that story has kind of been forgotten very, very quickly. And of course, let's not forget that on the 1st of January, the new points-based immigration system will come in, and we're going to see, you know, the future of what's going to happen with the NHS in a context where the salary threshold, which has been set by Priti Patel and others with the point-based immigration system, will mean that I think it's 26,500 is the minimum threshold. So many people who work in the NHS wouldn't earn, particularly people who work in the sort of cleaning and the other kinds of support services within the NHS would never earn anywhere near 26,500. They're just not going to be allowed into the country. And the same applies to the care sector. So we see the kind of hypocrisy of the heroes, where everybody who works in the health service is now a hero. These are the NHS heroes, the care sector heroes, the clap for carers. And the government is encouraging us to do this on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're saying, yes, but none of them can come in anymore because the income threshold is now being set at 26,500. So there's a complete hypocrisy. And it was quite shocking to many of us who were lobbying against the points-based immigration system that in the middle of a pandemic, when we could see the need for these migrant workers, the points-based immigration system still went ahead. And it's going to start on the 1st of January, and the government has been completely unapologetic about that. So I think we are going to see a crisis in the health and the care sector in particular coming down the line after Brexit. But again, that's not being talked about. So these are issues which we are storing up. It's not too far away now. It's just next month when this is going to start kicking in. So again, that sort of hierarchy of who are desirable and who are not desirable being defined by this kind of arbitrary threshold of £26,500 a year. Sorry to keep mentioning Brexit, but I think we've all gone to sleep a bit and thought, but Brexit is done and dusted. No, Brexit hasn't actually started yet. 1st of January, that's when all the fun begins.
That's true, yeah. Anna, you've got your hand raised. I don't know if that is no. Thank you, Louis, for your answer. Thank you so much. I can see a long question from Patrick O'Sullivan. wonder if we are seeing more visibly the worst between academic disciplines. Different disciplines understand and frame issues in different ways, with varying political and economic consequences and strategies. For example, the new book of Fontaine and Pulley. The social sciences underwent rapid development in post-war America. Problems once framed in social terms gradually became redefined as individual with regard to a scope and remedy, with economics and psychology winning influence over the other social sciences. Now, today we gave good examples of how different disciplines can contribute in a good way to the same topic. Does any one of you want to say something about it?
It doesn't include the history, because history is the magpie discipline. It's the everything of the past. We don't get involved in wrestling matches with the post-war social scientists. Jokes aside, yeah, I think segmentation, compartmentalization, micro-specialism, and the value of subjects to those who make policy would see, for example, I think sociology is much less popular than it was 50 years ago. I think the decline of some of the grand narratives, you know, the pressure upon things like Marxism, some of the German social theories, actually school, basically Frankfurt, Bielefeld. I think these things have all affected the likes of sociology, as did Cracker once upon a time, those who are old enough, and the rise of criminology. So I think there's lots of things going on there. I think Paddy's right to some extent, or at least these authors are right to some extent, but it's never as simple as that. The water's always far muddier than to be able to just carve things up like that, but I can see where that is going. And I can see it in history too, by the way, in terms of the different types of history there are.
Thank you, Don. Does anybody want to add anything to that? Any of the poets or Louis? No?
Well, I think just very briefly, what I would say is that in terms of the discourses around the pandemic, the fact that social science has been largely absent from those kinds of discourses, we've seen a lot of scientists, and then we've had a lot of psychologists, particularly behavioral scientists, but we've really lacked that kind of social science insight, and I think that's what we really need now to start bringing to the table. And Sir Patrick Vallance has got a call for evidence out at the moment, and I was having a long meeting with the British Sociological Association yesterday, where we're trying to pull together some sort of sociological evidence to present to Sir Patrick Vallance, to really try to put the social dimension into this and look at the social costs. But yeah, so I agree, and I think, you know, we spend a lot of lip service talking about interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, but working between social science and history, I think, is very valuable, and that's what we're trying to do. And of course, cultural studies as well, bringing poetry, sociology, and history. And I can see that Tony Murray in the chat has mentioned the bringing together history, sociology, and poetry is a heady and powerful mix. Thank you, Tony. That's exactly what we're aiming for tonight.
Thank you, Louis. I can see Tele has his hand raised. Tilly, did you want to?
Yes, just I'm glad of that initiative, to hear of that initiative, Louis. I'm sure some of you must have read Danny Dorling's article in the Observer last week. So yes, so I'm assuming you're connecting with him. Is that the case, Louise?
Yeah, we were talking about that yesterday. For those of you who didn't see it, Danny Dorling wrote a really powerful piece. I think I saw the version in The Guardian, it might have been in The Observer as well, where he was talking about the need for sociological analysis to understand the impact of the pandemic, which has been largely seen as a medical issue, which kind of makes sense, I suppose, but perhaps with less attention being paid to the social dimension. And that's what we're really going to see now coming down the track, is the massive social cost. We've already begun to talk about loneliness and all of the kind of associated issues, and Danny Dorling has been writing very powerfully about this as well. So thanks, Tele. I did see that. Yeah.
Thank you, Louis. I think this is the last question coming from Gio Horn. So she or he says, my question is, rather than waiting for history to repeat itself, what can minority groups practically do outside the good work in academia? Are efforts to counter the fake news, disinformation and hatred effective? Excellent question. Does anyone want to reply to you? That's an excellent.
Well, first of all, one of the reasons why we're here is because it's actually too late to stop all of history repeating all of itself in the present time, because as we've heard from our poets very powerfully, and as we've tried to describe, both historically and sociologically, the repetition has already occurred. That we've already got all of the things we've seen before many times on an individual level, reflected through the poetry and human emotions, to the more long distance view of something like Irish fever in 1847. So all you can do is I think keep working together, form groups, join with academics in things like this to actually give power to what academics do. I mean, none of us are under any illusion. Most academics do things for small audiences, and as worthy as it is, it doesn't get out there. We need to build bridges between what you're thinking about, Yao, and what we're doing, and what you're doing probably, and what we're thinking about, whichever way around that is. I think we need to work together much more actively, certainly. But unfortunately, history has already spent 9 months repeating itself, and it will happen again. We need to get the news out there. I want to say one thing, though. There has been some work by sort of, I guess, kind of anthropologists, behavioral social scientists, where there has been some understanding of mask wearing and of social distancing. I don't think they've been completely blind to all social science interpretations, but we've heard far too much from armies of mathematical modelers who essentially are just giving us different sets of data, all of whose curves and peaks go in the same direction. So it's either going up to 40,000 dead or up to 200,000 dead, but it's going up anyway. There's the idea that the sort of social surveys, social trends, those kinds of things are not being done in real time. And by the way, I think the publics that you're talking about, could actually be used to give us that sort of evidence, to get material about how they're feeling. So the poets, to me, represent an unknown quantity of people who feel the same way about these things. Sorry, I went on a bit longer than I intended to there, but I think it was a very thought-provoking question and statement there.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. Does anybody want to add something to that, about that? Okay, that was very powerful questions and powerful answers to that.
In there, Louise, Maria, apologies.
Sorry?
Anna has her hand up.
Anna.
Yeah, I'd just
Anna,
like to.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to respond to Yao Poon, and I think isn't it supposed to be the revolutionary's duty to make visible the invisible, because we know that this is coordinated. All the disinformation, what's happening in this country with the mainstream media is just shocking. You're talking about the disaster that's going to be visited on us in January, when it actually starts to happen. We are busted, and yet the government can still find £24 billion that it is now spending on, it says, on defence, which means preparation for America's war on China. So, when the NHS is suffering, when all our food is going up in price, when all these horrors are occurring and they're pleading poverty, just remember what they do find funds for.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anna. Well, is there any other question or something that we can add to that? And I think this is an excellent ending for this session. The interdisciplinary, the disciplinary way of looking into that, we all agree on that. Yeah, I think this is that's what we need to look for, answers to that catastrophe that's coming with the Brexit, as Louise pointed out. That, as she said, is didn't start yet. It will start on, and we'll start looking into consequences. And for social scientists, this is a very interesting time ahead, what we've got. And also for cultural studies and poets. Let me just reiterate my grateful to all of you, the 5 of you. It's been like a fantastic night, to be honest. It was so lovely to hear your presentations from, as I say, from such a different angles, looking at such an important thing that affects us all, migrants and non-migrants, particularly in England, that we've got not only the pandemic but also the Brexit. So if we don't have any other questions, I let you go. As I say to my students, I let you go now and reflect on what we've heard today, which I'm sure you've taken many notes. I did, and enjoy really the benefits of these talks. Yeah, and so well attended by so many of us. Just before I let you go, as I said, just remind you that we are in the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, London Metropolitan. Go to our website and register in our events. We've got many, and all of them are very, very well attended and very interesting. So thank you all. Have a lovely evening, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you everybody. Thank you to the poets. Really, really good. Thanks, Maria.